All right, so we're going to pick up now with part three of the Cold War video lecture. We're going to look at three aspects of the Cold War with this part of the lecture. We're going to look at the space race, we're going to look at the arms race, and we're going to look at McCarthyism. First thing I wanted to do was kind of review a couple of slides that we talked about in part one of the video lectures. We looked at this cartoon. I'm not going to go over it again and go into detail on it. But again, I just want to refresh your memory of the fact that both sides, the United States and the Soviet Union, both had new advanced weapons with atomic bombs, nuclear bombs, hydrogen bombs, and all these different types of weapons that could really cause a lot of damage and kill a lot of people and destroy a lot of things. And because both sides had them, explained through this cartoon, they didn't use those weapons and didn't want to use those weapons because they knew that the other side had those weapons. And if we used them, they would use them, or vice versa. I paired this cartoon with this question on the quiz. The point of view of the cartoon is that nuclear weapons did what? B, prevented war between the United States and the Soviet Union. It's because of that fear of what would happen if we use those weapons is why we didn't actually go into war with the Soviet Union and why it's considered the Cold War. Had you listened to the first part of this lecture, you would have had this question, which was one of the quiz questions, one of the three. This is a question that quite a few people missed, and I'm guessing it's because you didn't listen to the lecture. So make sure you're paying attention when we're going through this. So we're going to start with the space race. Sometimes when we look at the space race, sometimes especially younger folks don't quite get why this was a big deal following World War II and in the early onset of the Cold War. But it actually had a pretty big significance. Space was a brand new frontier, This is an aspect of the world that nobody really knew a whole lot about because no one had ever been there. We've never put anything into space. It was just kind of one of these things we talked about and we thought about. We assumed things about space and stuff like that, but no one had ever been there. We've never launched anything into space, so we really didn't know a whole lot about it. But because the space race is going to pick up, this quest to get to space and the things that are going to happen, it's going to change the dynamic of the Cold War, and it's really going to ramp things up and really cause things in the late 50s and in the 60s to get really, really tense between the United States and the Soviet Union. What kind of got everything started was the launch of a Soviet satellite called Sputnik. This was a real game changer in the space race. This was in October of 1957. The Soviet Union successfully launched the first satellite into space. It was not real big, as you can see in the bottom picture on the right there. It's basically just a ball that was a couple of feet in diameter, nothing real big. But just the idea that they were successful in launching a rocket that was able to get to outer space and launch this satellite was a big, big deal. Now, again, in the modern day, we probably don't think a whole lot about it, but this has a major impact on society because moving forward, your cell phones, GPS navigation, satellite radio, things of that nature, all of those signals come from satellites that are in space that are constantly moving and things of that nature. So this is really going to open up a whole new world. And we'll talk about how this relates to the weapons when we get to the arms race section. Because of the launch of this satellite, the Russians had the upper hand. The Russians had the advantage when it came to space. And it's really going to force the United States to really step up its space program. And in 1958, a year later, after the launch of Sputnik, the United States officially adopts a new program known as NASA, which obviously is still in effect today, and that runs our country's space program. And this is going to really heat up the space race battle to get to space. And there's going to be a lot of back and forth. The Soviets do get the first satellite into space. They are the first country to get an astronaut into space. However, the United States did kind of win the space race in the late 60s when we landed a man on the moon. And why all this is important, because satellites in space are really going to change the aspect of what's going on with the Cold War. And here's why. This brings us next to the arms race. And how are the two things connected? We're going to talk about that. Things have changed a lot since World War II by this point. At the end of World War II, the United States defeated Japan by dropping the 2 atomic bombs. Most of you are aware of that. And basically, how we did that and how you delivered those bombs was you had to put the bomb on a plane, fly the plane over its target, open up the belly of the plane, drop the atomic bomb. It would detonate, explode, and do its damage. Now we've advanced in weapons. We don't need a plane to transport these weapons anymore. There is a huge push for the buildup of military goods. We've talked about this before when it comes to militarism. This was a factor in World War I, it was a factor in World War II, and surprise, surprise, it's going to be a factor here in in the Cold War. So as we advance through the Cold War with these weapons and the military buildup, we are going to take a new focus on what we call WMDs, or weapons of mass destruction. And that's basically nuclear bombs, high impact explosives that will literally kill hundreds of thousands or millions of people and destroy entire cities or regions of a country. Now, because of the advancements with radar and things of that nature, we have to figure out a different way to deliver the nuclear bomb. We can't just put it on a plane and fly it to its target anymore, because odds are the plane's not going to be able to reach its target before it gets shot down. So as the countries adapted and developed, they started to develop what we call ICBMs, or intercontinental ballistic missiles. And basically what that is there's some examples in this image right here of different ICBMs. And basically what you would do is you'd load a nuclear bomb or warhead onto these missiles, and you could shoot these missiles. And these missiles could go literally thousands of miles. These missiles would shoot up into space. They would go and find their target, basically putting nuclear bombs on rockets. So this was a huge change and a severe threat when it came to the Cold War. In just recent news, in recent history, within the last couple of years, there's been a lot with Kim Jong-un and ICBMs in North Korea, and the fact that he has shot in some of these over the country of Japan and things like that. And everybody was kind of making a big deal about the fact that North Korea is able to shoot an ICBM, 1,000 miles or 1,500 miles or whatever it is. And personally, not that is not a potential threat, but personally, I kind of chuckle at that notion, just because shooting an ICBM a couple of thousand miles is not that big of a deal. I mean, as you're going to see, the United States and the Soviet Union basically had those capabilities for the last 60 years. So the fact that Kim Jong-un just now figured it out, but it, isn't a big deal, but it did make huge headlines and did kind of cause quite a bit of panic globally. You don't have to necessarily take notes on this stuff here. This is just to kind of show you how the buildup of weapons and missiles kind of took place over the years. I kind of go through the decades here. The 1950s, we had American intelligence estimated that a Russian missile attack would kill about 20 million people and basically wound about another 22 million people. Now, in a country today of 320, 330 million people, yes, this is still a lot of people, but that's still a relatively small number. But when we go back, 60, 70 years, our population was half. We might have been at about 100 million people in this country, if even that. So you're talking about killing or injuring almost half the U.S. population, and which obviously was a major scare. In the 1960s, things progressed even further. You had the Russians, they put a lot of money in producing more missiles, regardless of quality. This is where we look at quality versus quantity. America had built fewer missiles. However, the quality of the American missile was significantly more. In the 1960s, we had a missile called the Atlas missile that could travel about 5,000 miles at a speed of about 16,000 miles per hour. So that's obviously a pretty significant rocket. It can go quite a distance. So again, the fact that Kim Jong-un was able to shoot a rocket a couple thousand miles just a couple of years ago, not all that big of a deal compared to what the capabilities are of the United States. Also in the 1960s, we had developed the first Polaris sub. This was capable of carrying 16 nuclear missiles on board. Each missile contained 4 separate warheads, which could target on different cities. Basically, hence the one submarine could effectively shoot 64 nuclear warheads and basically hit 64 targets if it wanted to. And again, this is still the 1960s, which is about 60 years ago. So this is pretty advanced, and it's going to get even bigger as we move forward. By the 1980s, the U.S. has about 8,000 ICBMs. The Soviet Union's got about 7,000. We had 4,000 planes that are capable of delivering a nuclear bomb. Russia had about 5,000. So the defense spending, because of all this buildup, is going to skyrocket. 1981, the United States spent about $178 billion on national defense. That's the funding of military things, building nuclear bombs, funding the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, etc. Just 5 years later, by 1986, it was about $367 billion. So in 5 years' time, the United States literally doubled what they spent on U.S. defense spending. So that's a pretty significant number. And by 1986, now at this point, we are getting near the end of the war. The Cold War is going to fall here in about the next 4 years or so. But it's estimated by that point, the United States had about 40,000 nuclear warheads, equivalent to about 1 million Hiroshima bombs, which we dropped at the end of World War II. British intelligence estimated that one medium-sized H-bomb or hydrogen bomb on London would essentially destroy anything living within 30 miles of the detonation point. So weapons advanced quite a bit over these 30 to 35 years here. And a lot of this is predicated on the idea that we can guide these missiles with signals from satellites. So the fact that the Soviet Union was able to get a satellite into space first basically opened up the possibility that they had the ability to hit us with a nuclear missile before the United States was able to counter that attack. So they had the upper hand at that point. And this is why that space race was so important and leading into the arms race and the buildup of these massive military grade weapons and nuclear bombs and things of that nature. Side note, only 2 atomic bombs or weapons of mass destruction have actually only ever been used in the history of the world. And those are the 2 that we used at the end of World War II. So all of this money, all of this funding, all of these missiles and warheads and things that were developed have never actually been used in a war, which is kind of crazy to think about. And we still have them. We still develop them. We're still building them to this day in the event that we would ever need them to protect ourselves. Right here, there's a video of the Cold War movie. This is called War Games, and this was made in the 1980s, and it's just about a 5-minute clip. Go ahead and watch it. I'll share this out separately, and basically kind of just goes through the idea that can you really win a nuclear war? Mutually assured destruction. At the bottom, they're mad. Basically, the reason, going back to that initial cartoon where the soldiers were using arrows, this is what people knew. If we launched a nuclear missile or bomb of any type, the enemy was going to counter. And by the time we get to the 80s, the 70s, 80s, and stuff, and we have the Warsaw Pact and NATO, some things we'll talk about later, because we have all these things, um, the idea known pretty much by everybody was that, listen, if we launch, they're going to launch, and if so, we're probably all going to end up dead as a result of it. So because of that, we wanted to try to avoid nuclear war at all costs. Again, this is why over a course of 45 years of the Cold War, we never actually directly fought the Soviet Union. Again, watch this movie clip. It kind of goes through the scenarios. It's only about 5 minutes, so it's worth your while. Couple of discussion points to kind of make sure we hit on and to make sure that you remember when it comes to this graph over here to the right. United States budget 1940 to 1950. All these things do is just shows how much the United States was spending on defense. Again, that's military stuff. You can see the trend. What trend is represented in the chart right here in 1940. Only about 18% of the nation's budget was spent on defense. This is just before we entered into World War II. This is before the bombing of Pearl Harbor. By 1950, World War II is over, and things with the Soviet Union have really picked up. And by that point, we are at 32%. 10 years later, by 1960, when all this space race stuff and rockets and things of that nature really are at the forefront of everything, this country, the United States of America, was spending over 50%, 52% of its budget simply on defense. And then by 1990, when everything was over, when the Cold War essentially was done, that budget dropped down to 24%. So you can see how between 1940, 1950, and 1960, just how quickly our defense spending increased. And by 1990, when the Cold War was effectively over, that spending dropped down dramatically by half of what it was in 1960. And obviously, this buildup right here to the 52% was all predicated on this idea of the space race, nuclear war, developing warheads, missiles capable of traveling, 5,000, 10,000 miles, things of that nature. All right, that's going to bring us to the second Red Scare. A number of you are probably already familiar with this, so I'm not going to do a whole lot with this, to be honest with you, just because if you remember what the first Red Scare was in the 1920s, the second Red Scare is basically the same thing. It's the fear of communism spreading throughout the United States. In the 1920s, we had the Palmer raids, which some of you might remember, where there was some bombings. Mr. Palmer, who's the head of the FBI, did all these raids. They raided, hundreds and thousands of people's homes and things of that nature, basically found nothing under the suspicion or idea that they were communists. But by 1950, people believed that our government had been infiltrated by communist Russians. Basically, people in this country took advantage of our free election system, ran for office, were getting positions as senators, congressmen, getting cabinet positions in the presidency, and doing all of these different things to basically try and overthrow the U.S. government, basically from within, kind of a coup, if you will. So the idea in the 1950s developed with the second Red Scare is that we must purge our government of any of these potential communists and get them out of office and find out exactly who they are so that we can protect the sovereignty of the United States of America. One of the central figures in that battle was a guy named Joseph McCarthy, Senator Joseph McCarthy. If I remember right, he was from Montana. Don't quote me on that, but I think he was from Montana. And basically, he's going to go into what we call the McCarthy trials. And basically, what we're looking at here is what we call McCarthyism, and obviously predicated off of Joseph McCarthy. he attempted to purge the government and society of communists. Uh, it kind of led states to do several things. States adopted loyalty oaths for teachers and government officials, where they would have to take an oath that they were not communists, they never had been communist, and all that kind of stuff. There was a HUAC, the House Un-American Committee. They investigated government workers and the movie industry and different things of that nature. Um, Basically in fear that movie stars, directors, writers, singers were trying to put a spin on entertainment, trying to get people to support the idea of communists. So they would investigate them, look at what they're doing, what they believed, who their associates were, things of that nature. And one of the famous questions from the era that was asked was, are you now or have you ever been a supporter of communists? Now, it's easy to sit here today and be like, no, I wasn't, but you have to put it into perspective of the time. It's the 1950s, early to mid 1950s. Don't forget, just 20 years before, this country was in the middle of the Great Depression, and the idea that the government would have complete control over business to protect jobs and income and things of that nature, a lot of people like that idea and kind of bought into it. So if you were asked, are you now or have you ever been a supporter of communists? If you said yes, because in 1935 you were broke and didn't have a job and needed money and wanted the government to do it because you blamed capitalists for ruining the economy, unfortunately, you're going to fall victim to McCarthyism and this whole idea. One of the main groups or kind of examples of how this could impact you was what we call the Hollywood 10. Basically, what this was 10 witnesses from the film industry who refused to testify against people who were suspected of being communists in Hollywood. As a result of their refusal to testify, they were sent to prison and served prison time. They were labeled Fifth Amendment communists because you'll learn about the Fifth Amendment next year in government class, but you can plead the Fifth when you testify. And if you say, I plead the Fifth, they cannot force you to answer any questions. As a result of the McCarthyism and this second Red Scare and this fear of communism, you also had McCarthy's blacklist. This was a list of about 500 writers and actors and producers who were not allowed to work on Hollywood films because they were allegedly communist. And obviously all of this kind of stuff challenged the idea of the First Amendment, freedom of speech, expression, things of that nature. And this is like really important because you have to understand that at this point in time, with the mass hysteria of what was going on, people feared communism so much that if you were accused of being a communist, whether true or not true, your life was over. You were going to lose your friends, your family, your job. You weren't going to be able to get another job. I mean, your life was effectively over if you were accused of being a communist. And everybody was kind of looking over their shoulder. It was, what were you saying? How were you saying it? Everything you said could be torn apart. And it really threw the country into a huge tailspin when it came to social things, because in the 1950s, everybody was dealing with this idea of the Second Red Scare, McCarthyism, and whatnot. And this is the last thing. April 1949, you read books, huh? All of these government officials are surrounded the teacher because this was one of the things that was really looked at and scrutinized. And the idea that, teachers who are educators who are trying to teach kids, are they supporting the idea of communism? Are they liking the idea of communism? Are they trying to get these kids who are young that are still learning about these systems and whatnot? Are they trying to basically convert these kids to be communist sympathizers during this time of uncertainty with the Soviet Union? So between the space race and who could get there first and the satellites and all that kind of stuff, leading into the arms race and the mass development of weapons and whatnot, uh, the 1950s was a pretty turbulent time within the Cold War. A lot of things were happening and whatnot. So this rounds out part 3 of our video lecture. We'll have 1 or 2 more, and make sure you have good notes on this stuff. There will be a weekly quiz at the end of the week that will cover this stuff. I don't know how many questions will be on it quite yet, but there'll be some questions on a Google Forms just like normal. So the better you listen, the more notes you took, the better chance you are of getting the questions right on the test.